So, this is our 10th session of the Stafford Beer Brain of the Firm reading group with General Intellect Unit. And we are on Chapter 10. Probably getting into the next section, we're going to break from the one session, one chapter cadence we've been on, because the chapters are going to start to get longer. And so we're going to need to do multiple sessions per chapter. But for this chapter, we're going to do the same thing unless it runs really long. All right. So Chapter 10 is the biggest switch. And we are going to just take a look at what Beer says at the beginning of the section about it. In the final chapter of this part, the need for a System 4 is disclosed. Systems 1, 2, and 3 are concerned automatically with the regulation of internal stability, but the organism needs also to maintain dynamic equilibrium with the external world. More than that, if the challenge of change and increasing complexity discussed in Part 1 is to be met, there must be systems for arousal and adaptation. All this is modeled by the brain, before the level of conscious direction, attributable to the board of the firm and to the cerebral cortex in the brain, is reached. That final level, System 5, is reserved for discussion later. In Part 2, cybernetics is put to work to create a model of the management of any viable system. There are passages of fairly tough going as the nature and implications of some of the neurophysiology are elucidated, but remember that once the issues are properly understood, there will be no real need to remember all the details. So we have largely gone through the neurophysiological background information. We are just going to cover the build up to System 4 and the sort of, we're going to work off of the background that we've built up here. So what are some general thoughts about Chapter 10? Shane, go ahead.
Yep. One thing that kind of stood out to me was getting towards the back of the chapter when we're talking about phase spaces and trajectories and such. Kind of defines the system as like a kind of an island in a phase space. It's an island in which the states, when they deviate, tend to return to that island, which is really fascinating because it means that like particular implementations such as bodies and such have nothing to do with it. These kinds of systems are abstract systems that have this like locality within a phase space, not necessarily locality in space in phase. Which is like the stuff that we were reading in the extended autopoiesis paper, making the distinction of like the body as being a tool that the system uses to help maintain its phase space. It's not like the body is not primarily identified with the system. The body is a kind of artifact produced by the system. It's just really interesting that that's right there in here. It's almost like you don't need to puzzle about it very much. It's just right there in that chapter.
Right, fair enough. So, Shane, your connection is quite bad today, so you might want to do an Audacity recording, just so that we can add that in when we produce the final version. Yeah, so we'll get to that figure and the discussion at the end of the chapter, but that is an interesting point, that, yeah, this is a generalizable cybernetic phenomenon, and the body constitutes itself along these principles. Okay, any other comments? Okay, Rudy, please go ahead.
Yeah, I commented about this in the chat earlier, but I think this chapter as a general gives you what Jeremy said a few sessions back of why System 4 was so important. And if you don't have a good System 4 and System 5, it just wanders off or can collapse onto System 3. And how, this biggest switch is critical. And I think this chapter puts it down very, very well.
Sorry. And Lauren, go ahead.
I guess like just riffing off of that, I thought it was really interesting this chapter ended with an example on an epidemic because I think the whole chapter is thinking about how these systems relate to like crises management that we're all experiencing in various forms through our various governments. And it's really interesting to sort of use all of that as examples to think about when reading this chapter, because some people have coped quite well with crisis management and some people haven't. That's all.
Yeah, definitely. There were some Canadian examples that came to mind in this chapter for me, which maybe I'll bring up later. Because I think, this is where, for me, the stuff, like the book is starting to get the most interesting because we're talking about adaptation to a dynamic environment and about sort of mode switching in systems. This is really interesting stuff. Okay, so let's move on then. So we have, I'll just go over the intro. We have arrived at the point where the internal stability of the organism is ensured by the 3 lowest level systems, a control apparatus summed up as far as this is concerned by the term autonomics. And we have seen how this set of systems is fed by a vertical command structure originating in tensions as distinct from reflex responses within the thinking chamber of System 5. The final part of this book will deal with that 5th level global operation of the corporate body. This leaves the problem of System 4, which is the greatest linking mechanism between volitional and autonomic control. It is the biggest switch of the whole organization. A switch is a device or whole mechanism which transfers signals from one part of the system to the other. We have already met many switches in both the physiological and managerial aspects of this book. They are not simple flick-over devices, such as those which operate the electric light in either of these contexts. We examined their nature rather carefully in part 1 and called them algodonodes. At that time, we were looking at artifacts made up of wood and brass strips. Now we are ready to pick up the story in terms of neurophysiology. The many receptors which activate the nervous system, like the receptors which notify machines, men, and managers of change, are themselves switches of some kind. These receptors are attached to some sort of input cable, which they make alert, or along which they propagate a signal. When this cable length runs out, the input signal would be extinguished if it were not switched into another cable length. As we have seen, the neurons in the body work like this, passing the signal on from one nerve cell, plus its cable length, the axon, to another at a synapse. We need to look a little more closely at this switchgear. Engineers and computer men may think of a switch as a device which passes on and very likely amplifies a signal. That is, the arriving signal excites the system beyond the switch. In the body, this happens too, but the second possibility arises that the signal will inhibit rather than excite. This is an extremely important mechanism because of the problem of overloading, which would otherwise clog all the channels and switches further on. Much earlier, we saw that the theorems of information theory require greater capacity in the channels than the variety of the input system. In the body, this law is obeyed. Indeed, there is ample provision to meet the point. The maximum rate of discharge of receptor organs lies in the bracket of 100 to 200 pulses a second. The nerve channels themselves can cope with 300 to 400. Even then, we cannot afford to excite the entire nervous system with every input. Thus, whenever data transmission occurs in the nervous system, there is a dual mechanism in which excitation is balanced against inhibition rather than a single firing device as might be supposed. The same is certainly true in management, where more input signals may well be extinguished than are transferred and amplified at any switch. But it would be a mistake to think of this as a go-no-go device. there is a more subtle mechanism here, as there was in the algodenode. Okay, so there's some interesting points here. First of all, we are not speaking here of an on-off switch, right? This is not an on-off switch. It is an algodenode, which Beer describes in the back of the book, in the glossary, as an algodonically modulated probabilistic switch. That is, algedonic information is used at this node to alter the probability that something, which could otherwise be decided either analytically or by chance, will happen. So it's kind of a dynamic probabilistic switch, as opposed to the rather static on-off switches that we're used to from light switches. The other thing that comes up here is that Beer reminds us that a channel functioning in this way needs more. So a greater capacity in the channel than the variety of the input system. So I think this is really important when we consider organizational design as well. And then, so any further comments about this section? Jake, please go ahead. Jake H.
Yeah, I guess just like a question of, like, I had sort of thought of the different systems as like basically being made of people, but is System 4 supposed to be made of people? Because it kind of sounds, I mean, I know it's not describing like a fully mechanistic in the sense that it's like a machine, but like it sounds like more like a mechanistic, like when X happens, do Y, and that obviously involves like a whole set of algodonodes and all that stuff. But is that what System 4 is, or is it like...
So I think a useful way to think about this is that in the first section of the book, we moved from a simple circuit diagram to the anastomotic reticulum. And as we're going to see later in this chapter, System 4 is a switch, but it's a switch that takes in a huge number of inputs, and its probabilistic dynamism is actually determined by a lot of different inputs. So it's not simply like a control loop that you would see in programming where it's like if X then do for whatever. It's actually something very dynamic, and you can think of people performing this role because they're really like monitoring a lot of different information that's coming in and switching on that basis rather than just being kind of like a really simple control mechanism. So any further comments on this stuff? Sorry, does that help at all explain this? I think there's going to be some more examples later down the line that might help clarify like why this is more than just a mechanical switch that we're talking about here.
Yeah, no, I mean, I definitely got that it wasn't just like a mechanical switch. Like I sort of had a conception of how neurons operated and stuff before all this, and so it fits pretty neatly into that already in terms of framework. But yeah, I guess just seeing some examples probably later might help concretize it a bit.
Right. And remember, with all this stuff, like, it doesn't have to be a one person, one role kind of deal. Like, each person can be performing System 4 functions in the organization. It's not so neatly divided up like that.
Right. Maybe this is like a side effect of like computers getting a lot better, but it's like, why couldn't we have like some sort of neural networks or something that takes in all these different inputs and like outputs something that could be used by System 5, or maybe that is just being used by System 4 or something. I don't know.
Yeah, there's no specific reason why a computer couldn't do that. Because, like, as Shane was mentioning earlier in the chapter, like, these are sort of generalized cybernetic principles, and they're not bound to any particular organism. Matt, please go ahead.
Yeah, so this is jumping ahead a little bit, but for like System 4, like how people need to get involved, like I think like people actually do because you're kind of inherently dealing with something new, and machine learning systems as they exist actually aren't very good at that. What the interaction is, and it was cool because he basically describes an anomaly detection system a little bit later in the chapter, which is like a huge thing. Well, like that's one of the things you'll see companies advertising they want you to build, and but the thing is an anomaly detection system just it can mechanistically say that something is weird, but like then that triggers then humans actually need to pay attention to this.
Yeah, so I think it's kind of a matter of like in principle there could be a software solution for this, but actually humans are very good at dealing with those sort of things given the right context. Okay, let's move on, and we'll dig into the sort of implications a little bit more later. We get into the physiology of the synapse. This is. It's a little bit in the weeds here. I wouldn't say it's in the weeds, but it's just details. Okay, right. We get into the digression about the synapse. So I think he says on page 137, here is an algorithm par excellence. It is analogous to the managerial switch, which provides a go, no-go answer, but whose decision is governed by a conflicting set of excitatory and inhibitory inputs and a threshold value which is variable. It is not analogous, however, to any formal management information system, computerized or not, that I have ever seen, but it should be. Groups of human managers work in just this way. So this idea that the decision criterion for go, no-go should be the result of multiple excitatory or inhibitory inputs, and that it should have a variable threshold value is not formalized in most of our, or in, I don't know, any management system I've still heard of. But it does describe the way that managers actually work. So, Lauren, you're giving an example about this when we were talking the other day. I thought was pretty good. Could you describe that, and then we'll go to Jeremy?
Oh yeah, sure. I'm trying to remember exactly what I said. I used to work in a company that, like, sort of, as consultants do, you bid on projects that requires a go, no-go decision to see, because you don't want to waste your time writing proposals that you're not going to win. And we kind of did try to mechanize a go, no-go decision to some extent through using various factors, like, do we know the client? Is it in a country we've worked in before? Is it in our area of expertise? And that kind of thing. And at the end of the day, that process ended up just being an onboarding document for like teaching people this is how it works. This is kind of like how we make decisions around here for pursuing proposals. And in actuality, what happened was the sort of like directors and senior managers would receive notices for opportunities and would then, like, my old boss used to just go like, well, I really want to go on a holiday to Vietnam, and this project's in Vietnam, so well, I guess we'll go for this project. Or in other cases, decisions were made to pursue a project out of spite because the CEO said we shouldn't do this, and then my boss would say, oh, but I hate the CEO and I really want to like rebel as this like a small child, and would pursue work in spite of CD direction. And I definitely saw that sort of the messiness that goes on with making those decisions, like at a person level, and all of like the other more informal incentives for pursuing proposals influence decisions. Is that what we were referring to, Kyle?
Yeah, exactly. Like the drift from the formal definition and the actual decision procedure is just enormous. Because like your boss was taking account of factors that are just like way beyond the scope of that decision document. So like, we're gonna do a contract in Afghanistan because I'm going to piss off my boss is a consideration that they definitely didn't have on the list. Okay, let's go to Jeremy and then Brett.
Beer in this book comes up with two very different descriptions of System 4, and superimposing them is confusing as hell. And I don't think the two things are wrong, because Beer is writing this. He's telling us what he thinks about his model, but they're very different from each other, and I find in practice it's very difficult to superimpose them on a thing. They seem like different things. Like, one of them is the mechanism that transforms an autonomic system into a volitional system. And, the cliche example I have that you see in the movies all the time is some C-level executive who's absolutely impenetrable, who has a secretary or a personal assistant that they totally trust. And the only way you get to talk to this executive is to win over the PA or the secretary to the point where they're convinced that it's okay for you to interrupt that person or to barge into their office, and then you do. And that's definitely something of what's going on, although Beer is full of piss takes of how ridiculous it is to have C-level executives the way we currently do. So I would see him as seeing that as kind of a comical example. But then later in the book, System 4 is an internal model of the entire system that's used to speculate on what it could be through taking in data and R&D and planning and all that kind of stuff. So the one idea that it is the switch that switches you from autonomic to volitional is the description in this chapter. And the description in a later chapter is this is where R&D and dreaming about the future and all that it takes place, that needs a homeostat to bolt it to System 3 so that it keeps its feet on the ground. And I've got to admit, this is my third time reading it, and I'm just as confused as I've always been on those two different descriptions for the same thing.
Yeah, so I think for me at least, this makes the most sense in terms of the final example Beer gives of adaptation in response to Ashby, where, those two dimensions that you described seem to come together. But we might talk about that a little bit more at the end of the chapter. And that's a very interesting point, because the second definition of System 4 that you gave is the one that I'm more familiar with. Brett, please go ahead, and then Shane.
Yeah, so I do software development. I do DevOps stuff, as I think I mentioned before. And Lauren's comments reminds me of maybe think about this at a micro level. Maybe this is not the right level to think about it, of like a CD system where literally someone has to hit the button to say, here, deploy. But also you can have that automated. I'm not sure if that's the right metaphor or not, thinking of it, because I think there's System 4 is more complex than that. But that's all I mean, this thinking through this in that way helped me sort of visualize, like, you can actually have a gate where you can just have the computer just ship it and see what happens. And sometimes that then go no go is more complex than, oh, this might have a bug in it, but we're going to ship it anyway.
Sure. Yeah. No, it seems like a good example for sure, because like it's a consideration that's probably taking into account the external environment as well, like your clients or whatever, what their needs are, what the status of their operations is, blah, blah, blah. Shane, go ahead.
Yep. Just picking up on what Jeremy was saying, I think I agree that like it seems that System 4 is kind of overloaded a little bit. And I think Beer does sort of admit that early on, that it's quite a complex area of the brain and seems to involve multiple machines that are all kind of mutually involved with each other in ways that are kind of hard to really reason about. But also, I kind of wonder if some of this apparent problem is that System 4 stands in the place that I think would be occupied by something like the unconscious or the subconscious in psychological terms. And I think, as not amazing as a lot of psychology and psychoanalysis is, at the very least it has tried to grapple with the apparent multiplicitous nature of the unconscious. It does seem like there are many different factors all colliding with each other. Like there's the organism's model of the world, there's the organism's engagement with the world via desire, there's memory and recording, there seems to be symbol chains, all seem to bounce off each other in strange ways. And I kind of wonder if System 4 could be disaggregated a little bit, and it could turn out to be not a single switch, but a cluster of switches that, maybe the psychology folks or the cognitive behavioral folks are on perhaps the right track there, or like the neuropsychology, that kind of crossover point would be worth exploring to see if there's structure inside systems that we can talk about.
That's a very fair point. I've been listening to a lot of pragmatic Buddhist stuff lately at my advisor's suggestion, and some of that stuff is directly relevant to things that Beer brings up in this chapter, but just thinking about that very deliberate consideration of subconscious dimensions of experience, I think you're probably right. There could be some disaggregation that happens there, because that's a lot of what Buddhist psychology does. All right. Steve, go ahead.
Hey guys. I that's an interesting framing, Shane. And it was hard not to read this and feel like that System 4 was just some homunculus here where we're just pushing all the complexity into this one big unit. And that's not really actionable in any meaningful way too. And one thing that, so on the robotic side, what we struggle with a lot when I'm particularly sensitive to is that everybody loves to do their research for one little problem, whether that's motion planning or grasping or, AI or higher level reasoning and planning. But the biggest challenge that we always have to face, that everybody just wants to sweep under the rug, is that you have a massive integration task for pulling all of these different pieces together in ways that they can possibly actually communicate with each other in any sort of viable way. And it's all the stuff that goes unreported and unrecorded in the papers, because the papers will give you the math. And then, the code that you might get out of it will be full of all sorts of hacks and ways that break the math that are in the papers. And nobody wants to talk about that. And nobody wants to talk about how, there's a massive gap here that is in many ways the actual problem. Because the theory doesn't work when you start putting everything together. And I just couldn't help thinking about that with System 4, because it's where the rubber hits the road, and the complexity of getting not only lots of systems, but lots of different systems that are supposed to be talking different languages and having their own goals and priorities working together. There's nothing to take from that other than we've just pushed the problem down into something else. And, I don't know, maybe that's the rest of the book, right? But that was my takeaway from that. And it just resonated with are we just the same problem here? We still don't really know how to pull all this stuff together in any sort of meaningful way.
Right. So it's really black boxing the issue in a lot of ways. I think there's probably some things we can take away from this that will be useful, but your point is very well taken. Okay, so we'll go to Jake and then Matt.
Yeah, apologies, this isn't a direct response to what Steve just said, but I have a question that fundamentally it's supposed to be that every viable system has every single one of these systems, right? By virtue of being viable. My question is just like, why does every viable system necessarily need like an outside and then or like a volitional characteristic? Could a viable system not also just be purely reactive as well?
I think we need to consider this in terms of degrees of viability. When we looked at the earlier example that Beer gave about why he decided to choose the human body as an example and not something else, he said that, animal ecosystems display some of these characteristics, but they tend to be very swingy. Ecosystems tend to be very swingy. And I gave that example of what was it? The algae forming on rocks, killing off most of life on Earth in an earlier geologic age. So the answer, I think, again, we're going to see in that Ashby example at the end of this chapter, but essentially you can have a viable system that has no volitional component within a rather static environment. But if you have a dynamic environment, your system is going to be a lot more viable if you do have a developed system 4. There are ways you can kind of get around that, like, say, if you're a bacteria or something, you have maybe just such a large number of specimens that there's enough variety there to deal with the environment, even without a volitional component. But in terms of more complex organisms, it's something that pays off to have, even if it's not strictly necessary. Because, as you said, the first 3 systems are really kind of like the bedrock of viability. And if you have those, then you can have, in a given environment, a viable system. Matt, go ahead.
Yeah, 4 kind of reminded me of, and what Steve was saying about it reminded me of Douglas Hofstadter, and he wrote this in the 70s, but I mean, but as far as I know, it's still right. He says in Gerdella Scherbach that we can create all these little task-based systems, but what human intelligence can do that machine intelligence really still can't in any meaningful way is decide to get good at a new task, and switch between tasks in ways that keeps the system doing what it's supposed to do. The idea of being able to get bored or divert your attention to something new and intelligent and switch between tasks. Yeah, that thing is still and I don't even know what we can do for that aside from it even just recognizing it as a separate capacity and one that machines aren't really don't really know how to do right now. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we could definitely see that behavior in more intelligent birds. It's not strictly human, but that is very restricted in what kinds of organisms can do that kind of behavior. Rudy, go ahead.
Yeah, a bit to echo the comment here. It seems like Beer is telling us what should be done, but not how we should go about doing this. And in one sense, it's good because it's too general, but the other sense, it's you give a general overview, but okay, like Steve was saying, how do I actually build this robot? How do I actually build CyberSyn so that it works? And I find that after a while frustrating, I must say.
Yeah, that's very legit. I do know, of course, the rest of the book is going to get to more practical organizational design, but as Jeremy was saying, this is not necessarily a solved problem in the text. So big problem if it is not. Matt, go ahead.
Yeah, the closest thing to like a real solution I can think of is like variety absorbers, like the information desk in Designing Freedom, where you have a bunch of different departments. Then you have like an actual desk where other people can like ask direct questions. And because we do have humans as components in the system, like we don't actually have to fully formalize it. Like we can actually say, well, humans have this capacity. You have like an office, you have a special projects division, or you have ARPA actually. ARPA/DARPA. Interestingly enough, like its mandate is specifically to prevent strategic surprise. It was created right after Sputnik, and so like I don't know, like it seems to work pretty well. I read a good book on DARPA, Inside the Pentagon's Brain. Maybe that can be a thing.
Absolutely, we can use humans for this. Lauren, please go ahead.
Yeah, well, I think this discussion sort of made me realize that when I read beer, I'm still this book. Like I use all the misfortune I've had being in very dysfunctional organizations to make sense of what's going on, and I kind of feel like I still see where he's pulling in buy-in from people like me or managers who are like, everything's on fire, in fact. And I think like Ashby's model, which we'll get to later in this chapter, really helped crystallize a lot of the previous chapters. Because Ashby's model, I was like, oh my God, like this explains literally every breakdown I've had in every organization. And so I kind of feel like we're still at that point of like, here's everything is wrong. And then, I think, as I get the feeling the next chapters will give more of those like nuanced tools and suggestions for how to like mess up everything. That's just my 2 cents.
Yeah, I think that example is really crucial. And also I think we're exhibiting a bit of the behavior that Beer described at the beginning of the book, where these are the chapters about eating your vegetables, and then you get what you actually came to the book for in the final section. So we are kind of participating in this system exactly as Beer predicted we would. But, that doesn't mean all the answers are going to be down the road. So, perhaps we can see this in a positive light of, like, taking our frustration and channeling it into a critical reading of what's going to come in the next section. Shane, go ahead.
One very quick remark before we move on, but I think there are like concrete kind of recommendations, or like, I think we can relate this to concrete organizational problems, like the whole notion that this massive like multi-switch requires like multiple and like conflicting inputs and needs the ability to like dynamically resolve these things and feed them all together and do all this kind of stuff. It means that like you can't do Leninism. Like Bolshevism is straight out the fucking window. Like the ban on factions, the like ultra centralization, the purges and stuff, like catastrophically bad. Like the Bolsheviks lobotomized themselves in doing that. So I think we can. I think there are sort of recommendations we can take away from this. Like you need diversity and variety, and like sensory and processing variety in these kind of like higher meta levels of the system. Otherwise, you're just going to be a kind of brainless zombie, which is what the Bolshevik stuff turned out to be in the end.
I think that's a good point. I think the point about the channel having more capacity than the input variety is also a really useful point for designing organizations. And there's going to be some more that come down the road here as we keep reading. So let's do that. Let's move on and have a little bit more to digest. So he talks about. So he says, we speak about selective changes depending on conditions in the locality of particular neurons or particular management groups in applying our cybernetic model at this level. And there are more general, possibly quite general, ways known to the body and to the firm for changing the activity of the nervous system, upwards to excitability or downwards in depression. The hormones themselves and the transmitter substances are hormones may be supplied more or less plentifully. But drugs, especially of every kind, have elevating and depressing effects. These are easily recognized in behavior, but they are initiated on a micro scale, precisely by intervention at the switches. They are threshold changes of the algorithm node. Nicotine, for example, is a ganglionic stimulating drug, and smokers enjoy the excitatory effects. But, as with so many physiological mechanisms, the picture is very complicated. This is basically because the pharmacological effect of drugs varies on different parts of the nervous system, and because simultaneous changes in threshold in all manner of physiological switches often produce a total effect which works in a contrary direction. See how this works with nicotine, and bear in mind the counterpart mechanism in human groups. Nicotine excites the sympathetic cardiac ganglia and paralyzes the parasympathetic component to produce the typical rise in heart rate that smokers know. But in another phase, it may stimulate the parasympathetic and paralyze the sympathetic to produce a slowing effect in nicotine poisoning and perhaps in death. Threshold complex networks, dosages, all affect the situation, and this is why it is so difficult to prescribe treatment to correct elation or depression in patients who show either symptom to excess. What is meant by another phase in the penultimate sentence is perhaps best understood by considering alcohol. And then we get the alcohol example that I brought up in a previous discussion of like the up or downer effect. Where you're depressing the inhibitory response, so you get an up feeling. So this is quite interesting. You know, when we think about the prescription of like antidepressants, right? It's kind of like we sort of know what these drugs do. We don't really know what the localized effect is going to be on your nervous system. So take this dose for a couple weeks. We'll see what happens. You'll answer a survey, and then the doctor's going to make a decision with the patient as to whether to increase the dosage and continue or to try a different drug, right? Because we just don't know what the specific effect is going to be because of localized effects. So that's quite interesting. Matt, go ahead.
Yeah. So on the antidepressants and paradoxical effects thing with alcohol, you know, it also has one because something that's way too common is actually that people will actually, you know, go on antidepressants, and like as they're starting to work, that's when they'll actually kill themselves because now they actually have motivation. Like,
right, it gives them the motivation to carry through with a suicidal volition. So that's, you know, quite tragic. I certainly was very frightened going on to antidepressants for those sorts of reasons. Because it's like, well, what's the aggregate effect going to be on my psychology, even if these particular effects are fairly well known? Fortunately, there was really no side effects that in my case. Okay. But I do think that the volitional component and its interaction with the lower systems in the body is very interesting to consider when we think about like these kind of pharmacological effects. Because like, you know, there's overdosing, which is something that involves volition and the overall physiological state, but it's actually producing these kinds of contradictory effects that Beer's describing, right? Like with the nicotine overdose, where it switches over from being excitatory to actually being inhibitory to the point of death. But you can think about other drugs where that similar effect can occur. Okay, so in general, the activity of the whole body may be excited by pharmacological intervention at the switchgear, so that people become excited or more excited or positively euphoric. Beyond that state come tremors and then convulsions. Alternatively, depressant drugs bring sedation or tranquility or trance, and beyond that state, a general anesthesia and then coma. Death may result in either case at the end of the line, and that would be quite explicitly because the interference is so gross that the stabilizing mechanisms already discussed can no longer work. This is the way that the basic switchgear operates. As was said just now, it represents a set of mechanisms which we understand how to copy, witness the algodenode, and which is copied rather closely in human decision-taking, especially by the social group. Yet, it is not reduplicated in automotive systems driven by computers, although that would be perfectly possible. What may not yet be possible, and this is something to which we ought to be alert, is to understand, yet alone reduplicate physiological control mechanisms which are not straightforwardly mediated by the nervous system as described. He talks about ESP here, and how ESP could never really be ESP. It's always just going to be a phenomenon created by a sense we don't understand yet. Because if it's not sensory, if it's extrasensory, then how is it an input? That doesn't make any sense. It's a poor description of the phenomenon. And he goes into sort of discussions about like pheromones and smell. We think about like the people who lose their sense of taste and then have trouble bonding with people. That kind of phenomena. Shane, go ahead.
Yeah, I think it was about this point, by the middle of page 139, that I was starting to think, the deep unconscious needs to be accounted for here. That because Beer does talk about learning, but the thing you get from looking at psychology and psychoanalysis and stuff is that the volitional subject emerges after enduring this very long process of learning how to engage with the world. And that kind of becomes more clear if you raise a child and actually watch this happen. You can see a subject emerge that has volition. It's not a pre-given thing. You can't just count on it being there. And even with the rats here, a lot of this could be pheromones or could be pheromones plus learned behavior, and in a kind of inextricable mix. So I think this stuff is definitely involved here, and I think we kind of need to look a bit more closely at these subconscious. He says it's not ESP, but it is something beyond normal volition and normal sensing into a weird combinatorial sort of processing procedure.
Yeah, I mean, ESP is basically a pre-scientific description of the phenomenon. It's basically hand waving. Matt, go ahead.
A quick aside on hearing him talk about ESP. It is wild how how that was a thing that people were seriously considering in the first half of the century. I read a Turing's original AI paper, and he actually addresses it. I was oh man, how do I design it to make sure that someone with ESP can't cheat? Because man, the statistical evidence for ESP is just it's just overwhelming.
Yeah, definitely. It was given a lot of serious consideration. And I think most of the things we see from the mid-century with really out there psychological exploration, there's areas where the backlash against it was probably excessive. You think about psychedelics research and how that's finally coming back into being studied after it was discredited by its use by the CIA and stuff, and just kind of general expansion into drug culture. So it's I think Beer's point here is well taken, but we should consider probably not the overwhelming statistical evidence for ESP, but just actual phenomena that we may be able to study in ways that weren't possible in the past. Lauren, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I'd be curious to get other folks' thoughts on this, because coming from a psych background, and having dwelled on these paragraphs together, I kind of feel what he's really digging at, is sort of coping mechanisms, because drugs and alcohol and that kind of thing are frequently used coping mechanisms for people. And if you want to bring it back to management, there are, I hate to analogize, we're not meant to analogize, but there are analogies for like similar things being used in businesses as coping mechanisms. And it's one thing to say, oh, I see this as an unhealthy coping mechanism, but I'm doing it anyway. And then having done very similar things in firms where, say like, I also use like consulting management, that's my background, but like frequently there would be discussions around, okay, we keep doing this. We keep, trying to write proposals. We overstress ourselves. We work too long. We keep doing these things that are really harmful to the people in our organization, and yet we can't break out of that cycle. And so I wonder if the kind of like that's what's kind of like being alluded to, and I think that's how it makes sense in this conversation anyway, sort of bringing the physiology back to the business.
Yeah, I think this does get to something we're going to see a little bit later in the chapter, which is about the way that the System 4 can initiate, like system-wide, step changes, in behavior. And you can think about like, okay, let's put the organization into, retreat to, do a self-diagnostic and try to come up with solutions to all these problems as a kind of step change in that way. It is a kind of like, is kind of analogous to taking a drug as a coping mechanism in order to induce a sort of drastically different physiological state. So we then have this discussion about the rats. I'm interested to kind of see if anyone has attempted to queer this research and break down the gender descriptions being provided here. I may still hold up in the face of that kind of scrutiny, but I wonder if like STS people, queer studies people have sort of like looked at this kind of thing. Matt, go ahead.
So yeah, for the rat stuff, I mean, like this is still, I mean, minimally was still being taught when I was doing psych courses, in like the late aughts. And though, interestingly enough, so we have still not found any human pheromones. Like they've been trying to find them, but, and I mean, that doesn't mean they don't exist, but, yeah, it's weird.
Okay. Yeah, that is pretty weird. That is pretty wild. Yeah, there's so much of this stuff, like in neuropsych, that is really frontier research and is treated as being way more stable than it actually is. Yeah, Lauren, go ahead.
Yeah, I think this paragraph really underlined my general discomfort with like this book, because it is very divergent from where queer studies are going, where there's a conscious decoupling of like identity, expression, and body. And this really feels like it's trying to pull all those things back together and to put it into like a body. And so like it kind of has those like undercurrents of gender essentialism or like identity essentialism, where like you have these fixed components that make you as an entity, as a unit, as a being, and that's fixed. And I don't really have anything more to comment about that paragraph, but yeah, it kind of gave some clarity on where like kind of modern social like psych is diverging from these kinds of ideas, I guess, for the past like 20 plus years.
Well, I think we can read the possibility of sort of like bringing in biotruths by making reference to the human body as an example of a viable system, or sort of the paradigm example of a viable system, and relying on physiology so heavily. But I kind of feel like the opposite tendency is also evident, in that it's trying to abstract to sort of cybernetic principles that are disembodied. So I do kind of see this sort of research as like a bit of a precursor to like Haraway. It's just it's that problem of analogizing, right? Like, making tendentious analogies is a problem and worth a lot of critical scrutiny. But I don't think it's purely one way or the other thing. Like, I think both tendencies are evident in the text. The sort of social psych, or this tendency to like disaggregate from the body, it can see some background in this kind of text here. But a lot of people have commented on how The Heart of the Enterprise is a very gender essentialist text in some ways, so you're not off the mark in that regard at all. Matt, let's and then Jeremy.
I still think you can have a more granular view of gender and still have this stuff, because I mean gender is just it's a low resolution representation, it's the 8-bit version, but you can separate out some of the things that we'll put into this gender of rat are the traits to produce this pheromone that produces this quality, but obviously not all the male rats are going to have that, not all the female rats are going to have the the ones that are put into those bins are going to have all those traits. You can still be flexible, just that he's just chunking it.
Yeah, I mean, we can think about gender as a variety reducer that is quite dysfunctional. It does have sort of practical utility as a variety attenuator, but it also causes a lot of harmful effects. Jeremy, let's go on.
So I talked to Elena Leonard about the sexism in some of Beer's texts, especially The Heart of Enterprise. And she was like, yep, that book is sexist. You know what I mean? She didn't equivocate at all. She was like, yeah. And she was like, Stafford really started to tackle feminism more seriously in the 90s. And that if you look at his last books, he's using S/HE for pronouns most of the time, which I think by 90s standards is fairly gender neutral. We wouldn't use S/HE today, but if you put it in the history of 1994, for someone from the greatest generation, it's not bad that he was convinced to use more inclusive pronouns. And it's something we need to deal with in reading Beer, is that he just absorbed the sexism of his time, and it took him really towards the end of his life to begin to interrogate that in any way at all. Another part of it that makes it hard is that The Heart of Enterprise is written with the voice of a 1970s businessman. And he's very clearly sending up that character. A lot of The Heart of Enterprise is satire, and you don't realize it till the end. So you think he's being serious, but the voice he's using is a send-up. But because you don't realize it, it's not very funny. You know what I mean? I guess it's funny in retrospect to some degree. But yeah, Elena was the first person to be like, yep, yeah, this shit is sexist,
Right. So I think it's pretty clear that Beer was a fairly progressive thinker, but basically lagged behind the feminist thinking of his time. And yeah, S/HE was the woke way to write in the 90s. That's correct. And also I know people who refuse to use anything other than he as pronouns in 2018.
To be fair, Stafford had a lot of mentees, did a lot of mentorship, and was very, very progressive in having female mentees who I met, who I talked to about what Stafford was like as a mentor, and he was incredibly generous to them, even in circumstances where there was institutionalized sexism, that he helped them break through with his authority within the institution. So it's more complicated than just his narrative voice, you know?
Right. Fair enough. Yeah. That's also good to consider. So there's a lot of layers to this. I think we're going to get into more of it as we continue through the book, but it's definitely worth interrogating and considering the entire biographical picture as well as what we see in this text.